Hello everyone, Donny Carr here with another in the studio. In this episode, we're going to have a look at a mixing example from a remix I finished not too long ago. This track in particular gave me some serious fits getting the low end to sit right. I eventually got there in the end, but I thought it might be worth walking you through all the mixing moves and adjustments I made to get to that end result, especially because this is a track that's actually going to be released. It's not just an example project for YouTube. This is an actual project that I finished that will actually be released on a good label. So I thought that might be something interesting for you to see. So let's have a dive into this track here. So I have pretty much all the elements muted here except for the low end elements, which we will be talking about. So here we go. Okay, so really simple. There's only a few elements happening here. We got the kick, we got the bass, we have the low tom, and then that kind of mid-range bass wash sound. All right, so let's just dive in here. So firstly, let's have a look at the kick. I'm going to mute the tom and this bass fart sound. Okay, so one thing to note before we get going here is this is the mixdown project we're in now. So I have everything bounced to stems, and all these stems have been previously treated and processed in the production phase. So there's not a lot of processing here, but I still want to walk you through this. So on the kick, we have an EQ, and there's only a few cuts happening here, but they make a huge difference, I think. So the first one is this cut at 200 hertz. I find that I do this on most kicks I work with. That 200 hertz area, there's a lot of overlap that happens. You'll get, obviously your bass will be sitting in that area, or you'll at least have some upper harmonics of the bass in that area. You'll have maybe the lower end of synth sounds, maybe some lower effect sounds are happening down there, or bass accent notes, or maybe a vocal. There's just a lot of overlap in that area. So I find scooping some of the kick out in that range really helps clear up the mix in general. It helps the bass come through with more clarity and definition. And I just, in general, personally, I don't really like that area of a kick drum anyways. So let's have a little A-B here. So yeah, just kind of get this like boxy, a little bit of like a honky boxiness happening right there. It's not pleasant anyway, so I just like to get that out of there, and you can hear the bass is coming through much more clearly with that cut. So that's something I do quite often, not always exactly at 200, but in that area depending on the track. The next thing I've done here is cut the low end of the kick up to 50 hertz. Now I don't usually cut this high, and but in this particular case, I felt like it needed it. So without the low end cut, yeah, I just think it's really just defines the kick much more. It just kind of focuses it, or it's much more focused rather. And this is a good example of, sometimes I feel like you end up needing to cut much higher than you may initially anticipate or think that you need to. It's easy to fall into the trap of mixing with your eyes and just, you know, looking at the EQ and saying like, oh, 50 hertz is too high to cut on a kick. It looks like I'm cutting too high, so therefore you don't do it. And it's easy to fall into that trap. Don't do it. Use your ears. You know, if it sounds good, it is good. And that's something I find myself struggling with sometimes, is looking at EQs or whatever and saying, oh, that looks good, you know, but then I have to tell myself, no, does it sound good, you know? So don't fall into that trap. So in this particular case, I thought 50 hertz was where I needed to cut on the kick. There's a couple other little cuts here. This one right here is at 55 hertz, which is actually the fundamental of the kick drum. I felt like as I kind of A-B'd it there, A-B'd the on off of that EQ cut there, you can hear that when it's off, that fundamental just really pokes out quite a bit. I just felt like it was a little bit too overbearing, that fundamental frequency, so I just felt like I needed to dial that back, so I ended up cutting at 6 dB right there, which is quite a lot on the fundamental of a kick, but I felt like it needed it, so that's what I did. And then we have another little cut here at 111. Now this is because the tom drum, the fundamental of the tom drum, is happening right there at 111. Let's enable the tom. You know, so I made a small compromise and I just notched out a small cut on the kick at that fundamental frequency of the tom, ended up taking out 4 dB there, and I think that's allowing the kick and the tom to sit nicely together. Now let's move to the tom. So the tom drum, we have just a low cut that's cutting everything kind of below that fundamental, so around 100 hertz here. Yeah, just to, you know, keep things tidy and cut away any unnecessary low-end frequencies that I just don't need. Now this next thing is kind of partly a mixing decision, but also just a decision to bring more life and excitement to the tom. As you can see by looking at the imager here, that the tom is kind of dancing around the center line here. So what I did is I made little panning adjustments to each of the hits, just kind of slightly panned it off the center line. I mean, it's still central focus, but it's just kind of dancing around dead center. It's kind of dancing around the kick. And that does two things. That allows it to play nicer with the kick and have, you know, more space, so they're not right on top of each other, the kick and the tom. And it just makes it sound a little bit more alive. It's moving around, it's more interesting. But it's also kind of a mixing decision as well. And so I did that when I actually programmed the tom, but I felt like it needed a little extra panning, just a little extra. So I threw on this pancake plugin and mixed it in about 20%. So without it, and with. And I think that little extra panning back and forth is allowing it to sit a little bit better with the kick. It's not a huge difference, but there is a difference there. Mixing is about a bunch of, or making a good track really is about making making all these little moves and adjustments and decisions that end up to something, you know, either good, bad, or somewhere in the middle. But it's all those little decisions you make along the way, all those little adjustments. So every decision along the production process counts in the end. There's not, you know, one big EQ move or something that you could do on the master that's just going to make your mix sound amazing. No, it doesn't work like that. Doesn't work like that. Okay, so let's have a look at the bass. We have just a ozone EQ here, which is rolling all the way up to 100 hertz in this particular case. So again, I don't usually cut the bass quite this high, but in this particular case, I felt like it needed to sit right here at 100 hertz. If we mute that, yeah, just kind of flabby, muddy. It's fighting with the kick. It's just congested in the low end. I mean, this took a few different tweaks to get it to sit right. I initially had it, you know, cut much lower, and then after, you know, listening back against reference tracks on different playback systems, I eventually kept nudging it up till I landed at 100 hertz, and I felt like it sat nice there. So this is again another example of sometimes you need to cut higher than you might initially think you do, or you might get you might fall into that trap of looking at the EQ and, you know, telling yourself, oh, that looks wrong. I shouldn't cut my bass at 100 hertz. That looks wrong. Don't fall into that trap. Okay, so cut the bass, cut the lows of the bass, and that's just helping it sit with the kick. Again, you want to pick which element will dominate the low end of your track, either the kick or the bass. You need to pick one or the other. If you try and have a huge kick and a huge bass playing at the same time, it's probably not going to end up well for you. So one needs to take precedence over the other, unless they're not playing at the same time. Then go for it. All right, so the next thing I have on the bass is a dynamic EQ, and this is in the mix down is typically the only time I will bust out dynamic EQ, just for cleaning things up, cleaning up some clashing frequencies is what I'll use it for mostly. So in this particular case, I'm using it to duck the fundamental of the tom, but this time on the bass. So you can see that happening here. So whenever you can see that reacting to the tom whenever it's playing, and it's ducking out about 6 dB where the fundamental of the tom occurs. I felt like I wanted the tom to have precedence, when it's playing in that 110 hertz frequency area. And so that is allowing the bass and the tom to kind of play nice with each other. And then I have the bass fart. Which is pretty drenched in reverb, so it's got it's a nice wide sound, and that's a nice contrast to the mono kick, bass, and tom. So that'll pair nicely, but I did end up having to cut some of the lows out of this one too. I rolled off all the way up to around 170 hertz on this one, to clear out space for the other low end elements. So yeah, that's all of the, you know, mixing moves and adjustments I made to this particular track. Again, don't underestimate the volume balance is crucial to get that right, obviously. But yeah, I just took a few different attempts and tweaks to get this to sit right, and you know, listening back on different playback systems against reference tracks, you know, each track presents its own unique challenges. So I mean, even though it sounds simple, there's not a lot of elements, but sometimes, you know, yeah, it just takes some trial and error, some critical listening. I mean, if you need to take a break from the track for a few days, then I highly recommend that too. Come at it with fresh ears. You'll get there in the end. Just don't give up. So that's how I mixed the low end of this particular remix. Hopefully you found this video helpful. Hopefully you took something away from it. But you know what? Let's do a little A/B comparison here before we go. So I have a little snip bounced out. And this one is as you've heard it with all the processing enabled, and then we'll kick in the one with everything bypassed so you can hear kind of a before and after. So as is, with all the processing enabled and without. Just a jumbled, muddy mess. Oh my God. That was like dog shit. So yeah, I mean, really, all I really did was just adjust the levels on this in this particular track. Getting the levels right and some EQ moves go a long way. It doesn't need to be fancy. So that's it, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Leave me a comment or question, and I will talk to you soon. Cheers.